Okay, noswaith dda, good evening everyone. I just have a couple of announcements to make first, which I will do bilingually. Felly, croeso heno. Does na ddim larwm tân fod I fynd off heno, felly os ydy'r larwm tân yn mynd, dyn ni angen mynd allan drwy'r fire exit. Mae 'na ddau yn fama, neu mae'r ddau yn y top yn fanna, a wedyn dyn ni angen mynd i'r muster point sydd i'r chwith yn fanna. Felly, just a quick announcement, we are not anticipating a fire alarm this evening, so if we do hear the fire alarm, we will need to exit. We have 2 fire exits down here, and 2 in the top there, and then the muster point is just to the left. So if a fire alarm does go off, we will need to exit the building. So that's the boring stuff out of the way. Felly, croeso I chi gyd, welcome to you all. This is the inaugural seminar for the John Shrigley seminar series. So we received a very generous donation from an alumnus called John Shrigley, who graduated from the School of Psychology in 1974. And the only stipulation was that it was to be given to the School of Psychology and to do something with psychology and the arts. So we had to think about it, and we thought, why don't we create a seminar series where we invite esteemed researchers to come and share their research with us, with the public, with our students, with our staff, and just share what's going on in the psychology of arts. So that's a little bit of background for you. Before I introduce the lecturer, or the guest speaker, my apologies today, I have been asked to say that we do have some other graduates from the class of 1974. So if there is anyone else here that graduated in that year, please make yourselves known. We have Mike over here who would like to talk to anyone who is from that year. So if there is anyone, please do come and have a chat. Okay. Brilliant. So that's enough from me, and so I am delighted to introduce our guest speaker this evening. So Dr Rebecca Chamberlain is from Goldsmiths University of London, and I'm going to allow you to introduce yourself a little bit, but we are all very excited to hear your talk today. And at the end, there will be a chance to ask questions, so if you do have any questions, just pop your hand up and we'll come round with the mic. Okay, please welcome Rebecca. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elle. Can everyone in the back hear me okay? Great. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. I've never been to Bangor before, and particularly delighted that I've been invited to be part of this series on psychology of the arts, because I think it's something that is sort of relatively, I guess, little known in the wider field of psychology, but is sort of gaining in prominence. And I think hopefully I don't need to convince anyone in this room that art is a fundamental human activity that plays an enormous role in many people's lives, and so it's very worthy of psychological study. And in fact, all of my work at Goldsmiths centres around psychology of the arts, so we're a real hub for this kind of research field. For those of you that don't know Goldsmiths, it started off as a kind of craftsman's college. It's well known as an art and design school. It produced a lot of the young British artists in the 1990s, and still is very much on the cutting edge of sort of contemporary art. So as a psychology department, we really sort of interact with that kind of artistic atmosphere. And to that end, I established a master's program back in 2018 on psychology of the arts, neuroaesthetics, and creativity. So we're sort of training up the next generation of researchers in this field. What I want to talk about today is kind of two sides of a coin. And so I've titled the talk, "The Artist Tracing the Artist," and I'll explain more about what underlies that title in a second. But I guess, so the talk is all about drawing. Why drawing? I love to draw. So before I moved into psychology, I went to art school, and I still continue to draw to this day. These are some of my drawings. I love the sort of immediacy of it as an art form. It's a really good way of paying attention to the world and looking closely. And so I've always found it fascinating as a practice, and it was only as a psychology undergraduate student I realized that psychologically it's a really interesting phenomena as well. And I've sort of alluded to this already, that drawing, we may be professional artists, we may be hobbyist artists, we may integrate art into our lives, but art has been a feature of human society for, over 50,000 years. So in this sort of big bang of creativity that happened in the Upper Neolithic period, we already see evidence of these kind of art-making behaviors, which I think really says something about how fundamental and important artistic expression is as a form of communication and laying down memories, integrating with early rituals. And I think also as a psychologist, drawing can be used as a way to understand the kind of fundamental building blocks of our cognitive system. So we can look at representational drawing, which is going to be the focus of my talk, to understand mechanisms of perception. We can use drawing as a window into memory, so we can get people to look at an image and then draw what they see and analyze those drawings to understand how perception and memory interact. We can think about how drawing facilitates other cognitive abilities, like learning. So how does drawing help us to understand things like scientific concepts? How does that interact with our motor systems? And then finally, I guess crucially, in harking back to that idea of cave paintings, is drawing as a tool for communication. How do I use drawing to communicate concepts to other people? How do we find common ground through visual representation, so interacting with systems of social cognition. So I think there's sort of many both personal and intellectual reasons why I think drawing is a really interesting activity to study from a psychological perspective. So that's what I want to talk about today. And as I said, I've split my talk into two parts. So the first is the artist trace, so that's really focusing on drawing behaviors. So, and particularly because I come from a sort of visual science background, I'm interested in what changes about our visual system and our attentional abilities as we learn how to draw. And I start off with looking at how we focus in on details, and then I'll talk a bit about flexible attention, the ability to zoom in on things that are important in the environment when you're drawing them. And then the second part of the talk I call Tracing the Artist. So I've been doing a lot of work in drawing, and that was really interesting. And I'm an avid art lover as well, so I go to galleries and museums often. And I was looking at artworks, and I thought, the way that psychologists think about the experience of looking at art seems like they kind of characterize it as quite a passive process. Like, you see color and form, and it's all about the involvement of the visual system, which obviously is true. But I thought, as my experience of an artist tells me, that when I look at an artwork, I'm also really thinking about what the artist was doing, what a brushstroke means in terms of the gesture they performed. And it struck me that I thought that was a really important way of connecting with artwork, that you sort of recover the artist's actions even in a finished painting. And so a more recent line of work is really to look at what is the interaction between the artist's actions and our experience of the artwork. And I'm going to be talking about some quite fun research that we've done in collaboration with the computing department at Goldsmiths on robotics. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain and this idea of motor simulation. I have tried to pitch this talk for people who don't have any psychological knowledge. There will be some graphs, full disclosure, but you don't need to understand the graphs. I will explain exactly what they're showing. So hopefully, it will be of interest to those of you that have a lot of psychological knowledge and those that don't. And obviously, we've got time for questions at the end, so if anything is unclear, then do ask me. Okay, so we're going to start with the artist trace. So studying drawing is not a trivial thing to go about as a psychologist. If you think about, so I'll be talking about representational drawing. So I see something like a bottle on the desk in front of me, and I'm trying to accurately depict it so that I convey its kind of 3D form and the light and shade that kind of characterizes it. So obviously what's happening is that my perceptual systems are engaged, so my visual system is analysing what that object is, where are its edges, where are the light and dark bits, what do the contours look like. I then have to, that perceptual signal has to interact maybe with memory. So I have to think about, like, does it look like bottles that I've seen before? Can I use that to have a better understanding of how to depict it? A bit of imagination might come in. And then I have to make an action plan. So I have to make the drawing trace to represent what I'm seeing in the world. And I guess what was fascinating to me was that, and I don't mean to be sort of blowing my own trumpet, but I could always draw. I always found it easy to draw. There was something very intuitive about what I could see in front of me, and I made a mark. And for sure, I practiced a lot. I really enjoyed drawing as a child, and obviously got better as I went to art school. But there was something, as I said, that felt quite intuitive about it. And we know that's not the case for everybody. So even though all children draw spontaneously, so I'm the mum of a 15-month-old, and she's just starting to make those first marks with a crayon, which is absolutely delightful, and really hope that she enjoys that process. So it's something that we all do. And then around the ages of about 7 or 8, kids start to get very consumed with the idea that the drawing has to look like something, and it gets very tense and stressful when it doesn't. And I think maybe for those kids that find it a little bit easier, there's a really positive feedback loop, and they're engaged to practice, and they go to art clubs. And for other people, they just say, drawing isn't for me, and some people won't pick up a pencil for the rest of their lives, except to maybe draw a rudimentary diagram at work or something. So I guess what fascinated me was what we would call, as psychologists, individual differences. So the fact that there's this big variation in this skill, and it's down to something in this process that is either working quite well, working not so well. And so I was really interested in starting to sort of pick apart that, like what are the differences that underlie these differences in ability to draw. And I show this slide because this is the kind of standard task that I've used since I worked with Chris McManus as an undergraduate student and then a PhD student. So we give people either a photographic image or a still life kind of construction on the desk in front of them, and then we ask them to draw it as accurately as they can, and then we ask another group of people to rate the accuracy of those drawings, and that's how we get to a quantifiable measure of drawing ability that I'm going to describe in these studies. And obviously there are lots of limitations with that kind of approach, and I'd be happy to discuss that at the end, but this is from where we're starting from. Okay, so we've got a way of capturing individual differences in drawing ability. Now I started to think about, well, what are those mechanisms in this sort of perception to cognition to action process that we can start to sort of have a look at and see if they impact the drawing outcome. And I was inspired by some work with children with autism spectrum disorder, who, some of which, a very small minority of which, can draw incredibly well. And their drawing ability far exceeds any of their other kind of social and communicative abilities. So it's sort of this island of preserved or enhanced skill relative to their other abilities. So this top image here is by an artist called Stephen Wiltshire. So he has somewhat of a photographic memory. So he will go up in helicopters above. This is a cityscape of London and commit the experience of that to memory and then go back and reproduce it with startling accuracy. This bottom one is by a little girl called Nadia. I think she did this when she was sort of age 4, and she shows really amazing grasp of things like perspective. And I guess what is startling about these works is how sort of visually realistic they are. And there are a number of different ideas for why these kids with autism can draw in this exceptionally good way. And one idea is that they're very good at focusing on detail. So it's an account of autism that takes into account the fact that they have these kind of differences in their vision. And what that means is that they tend to see the trees rather than the forest, very crudely. So the way that our visual systems tend to work is that we get a gist first, so we see the wood, and then we kind of go in for the details. And it seems like with autism that process of kind of bringing the trees together in the wood isn't quite as well preserved. And the argument is for these kids, this kind of focus on the trees allows you to kind of ignore the distracting wood that might lead you down the wrong path or lead you to make drawings that are much more kind of symbolic and abstract and less realistic. So I took this idea and I thought, well, if it's the case for kids with autism, we have ways of measuring this ability to really zoom in on local details, so we can look at whether it's the case for adult artists or adults who have varying drawing abilities. So the way that we measure this idea of zooming in on the local details, on the one hand, is something called the block design task. So you show people an image like this, and then they have to recreate it using a series of blocks. It's actually part of one of the standard IQ tests. So what you have to do is you have to look at the whole, and then you have to separate it into its like little local parts, and then produce them as quickly as possible. We have another task called the embedded figures task, where you have a target shape, and then you have these contexts in which the shape is embedded, and you have to find the shape. And we can make these more or less difficult. So this is very easy. This becomes very difficult because it's very much embedded in the context. So again, you have to sort of ignore the global context, and you really have to focus on the details. So we give participants, these adults these tasks, and then we give them drawing tasks, and then we look at the relationship between the two. So we're looking at correlations between their ability to zoom in on the local details and their ability to draw. And what we find is a really strong relationship. So your ability specifically on kind of drawing out these local details seems to underpin your ability to draw accurately. Okay, so this was nice. That was my first PhD project, so that was very... I actually did it in Swansea at the art school there, working with some of their foundation students. So I felt happy about that, but then I was reflecting on my own practice, and I thought, well, zooming in on the local details is really only part of the puzzle. If you can't then zoom out and see the wood for the trees, if you make one little error with one of the trees, that can really throw off the whole thing. And as an artist, I felt like what I'm doing is I'm kind of switching between the two. Sometimes I'm focusing on the local details, sometimes I'm zooming out. And it's knowing kind of when and how to do that switching that seems to be important to me. And on a related note, artists seem to know about this tension between kind of local and global. So on the right here is a painting by Salvador Dali called Disappearing Bust of Voltaire with two nuns. So if you take a kind of global approach to it, then you'll see this bust of Voltaire. If you take a local approach and you look at these little nun figures, so it's this kind of, what we would call a kind of bistable figure. So there's two different interpretations. And then there's sort of a link to the creative process in general. So this is a sculpture by Picasso, and there's an anecdote about how he dreamt up this idea. So he went in his garage, I guess he was doing a bit of spring cleaning or something, and he sees a bicycle seat and handlebars, and suddenly in his mind they just come together, and he sees the head of a bull. So taking these like local elements, putting them together, making something new. So this idea of sort of flexibility, the ability to see things in different ways, I think is really common to artistic experience and might form the basis for some creative reasoning. the ability to kind of see things in a unique way. But I'm a vision scientist, so when we test this in the lab, this becomes very abstracted. But fortunately, we have tools as vision scientists to measure this idea of attentional flexibility. And we use what are called bistable figure tasks. So what you should experience here is a cylinder of rotating dots, and it's either rotating to the left or to the right. And every so often you might notice that the direction of the cylinder changes. Now, I'm not changing anything about the video itself. This is to do with whether you place one field of dots in the foreground or the background. So it's one image, but we can interpret it in two different ways. And what I can do is, in the lab, get people in, have them look at this image for a couple of minutes, and tell me how often it switches. What I wanted to do in this study is look at whether this relates to drawing ability and whether this relates to whether someone kind of describes themselves as an artist or not. And what we find is that it is the case that people who can draw well and people who describe themselves as artists are better able to voluntarily switch the representations. So if you ask them, like, can you switch it as often as possible, then they find these kind of attentional tricks that can do that, whereas non-artists have a harder time doing that. So they do seem to have more flexible visual attention in that way. One question that had always been sort of plaguing me since I started research in this field was, well, to what extent are these individual differences in vision and attention sort of baked in? Like, did I have more flexible visual attention that enabled me to have an easier time drawing? Or is it something that comes with practice? So as I learn how to draw, these attentional systems are engaged, and it's just like, training for any other kind of form of expertise. Particular muscles and parts of the brain develop as a function of that drawing. So I had the opportunity to work with the Pratt Institute in New York, and they're really great because they have sort of 4-year bachelor programs. Students go on to do all sorts of different majors in arts and design, but all of them do a really intensive drawing course for the first year, like a day's practice every day, a week for something like 8 to 10 months. So what I did was I tested these students at the first, like when they came in, halfway through the year, and then towards the end of the year. And what we found was that their drawing ability developed, which was gratifying for the tutors there, but also their ability to the flexibility of their attention increased as well as a function of their drawing development. So this suggests that, yes, it's something that comes as a function of training. And I think in reality, as with any kind of skill that we develop, any form of expertise, it's an interaction between developmentally having some skills in place or some tendencies, some ways of seeing the world that mean that you get very excited about artistic creation, but those abilities then really get switched on by training in that relative area. And we did find with these art students, we had a comparative group of psychologists, and the art students already start off with much more flexible visual attention than the psychologists, even at the beginning of that training year, because of course they're getting into this really prestigious art and design school. They've already developed expertise in that area. But nice to know that training makes a difference. And it was actually really important for Pratt, because they were having a discussion about whether they still taught this drawing program to their first years, because they were like, well, the industrial designers don't really need to know how to draw. But we were able to show with this data that actually it has knock-on effects for visual attention, but also things like visual imagery that arguably is important for all students on these programs. Okay, I've got a couple more things to say about artists quickly. So we've also done some eye tracking work. So we're interested in actually what's happening in terms of artistic visual perception whilst people are drawing, because up till now we're just looking at, compare or correlating, relating drawing ability to external tasks. Here we look at how do artists look at images as they're drawing. And what we find is that artists take actually a much more global approach to looking at faces when they're making portrait drawings. So people with expertise in drawing seem much more interested in relationships between features of the face than the features themselves. So the non-experts tend to really focus on, the nose and the eyes and the mouth area. They care a little bit about the kind of overall structure in the face. Whereas you can see for the artists, it's really about all of those interrelationships of different features of the face and less about the features themselves. So there's evidence here on both sides that focusing on detail is really important, but taking that kind of global strategy, being interested in relationships between elements is really important. And then finally, because I think I promised on my abstract that I'd talk a bit about the brain. I don't do a huge amount of neuroimaging research, but I did get to work on a project during my PhD that was really fun, where we got artists in the brain scanner. And that was a bit of a nightmare because they all came with so many piercings that we had to get them to remove before they go in the scanner because it's a big old magnet. It was logistically challenging. And here we're just comparing, we did do some relationship with drawing ability, but here we're mainly comparing artists and non-artists, and we do see structural brain differences. So literally the amount of neural matter in parts of the brain is changed as a function of artistic skill. And interestingly, the stuff that comes up in the brain is much more about converting our perceptual representations into motor commands and fine motor control. So this bit at the bottom here is the cerebellum, and that cares a lot about control of fine motor movements. Medial frontal gyrus cares a bit more about sort of eliminating kind of distracting information that might influence the kind of motor commands. So we're not really seeing differences in areas that are typically associated with visual perception, which I think is interesting. Okay, so to summarize this first part of the talk, so drawing is supported by the ability to zoom into details and sometimes ignore the distracting bigger picture, but this kind of interrelationship between local and global information and the ability to kind of switch knowingly and strategically seems really important. And while drawing, artists take a more global perspective, focusing on relationships. And this seems to be getting better with drawing training. So it's not something that is entirely baked in. It's something that's malleable and can change over time. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the second part of the talk. And as I said, I was sort of inspired by the lack of a lack of acknowledgement of the role of the body in experiencing artwork. There's one sort of model of the kind of aesthetic experience or experience with art that sort of starts to try and get into this. So this is Pablo Tinho's mirror model of art. So the idea is that for an artist, you have this kind of initialization phase. So this is where the idea is really, forming, and then you have some kind of, you expand those ideas, you adapt, you make changes, and then you finalize the piece. I mean, this is a very kind of crude representation of the artistic process, but, the idea is, you're going from initial idea to finished product. And what happens for the viewer here is that they kind of do that in reverse. So we pick up the kind of surface level details of kind of color and form. Then we might sort of integrate with, what memories we have, and, get into the deeper structure of the painting. And then finally, I guess what we're trying to do is really get to the core of what the artist is trying to say to us, and this is this sort of meaning-making part. I don't really subscribe to this as the artistic process, and I'm not sure I really subscribe to it as the aesthetic experience, but I like the idea that there's this kind of symbiosis between the artist and the viewer, and I wanted to explore that more. So the key question for this part is, do the actions of the artist impact how we see and appreciate them? And so this is the kind of hunch I had when I was in the gallery, is that we don't often get to see this, right? We don't get to see Picasso doing this kind of live drawing of a bull with these beautiful kind of fluid, it's effortless movement. What we see is the finished product. But my hunch is that our brains are trying to recover part of that process. So by seeing the finished product and our knowledge of the artistic process and what the artist is trying to do, we might recover those movements in the final work. And slightly tangentially, this was a little bit informed by work I did when I was a postdoc in Belgium. I worked with an artist called Patrick Tresser, who was making these really funny little robotic artists, and he had an installation at the Beaux-Arts Gallery in Brussels, where I was living at the time. This artwork involved, it was portraiture, so someone sat in the chair, and then these 5 little robot arms busily got to work making drawings. So they basically take a picture of the sitter, they perform some algorithms around what's called edge detection. So they see like where are the edges of the image, and then they reproduce them. And it's funny because they just take a picture and then they're just outputting the picture with some, you can sort of change the affordances in the robots. So some of them are a bit more jerky, some a bit more smooth. But the sitter sits there for sort of half an hour, very as if they're sitting for a real artist, because they don't realize that it's not, at that point, Patrick didn't have robots that took in feedback from what they were doing. But they produce these quite lovely portraits. And so we're interested in how do people experience these robots? How does that influence their experience of the artworks? And this was this was 2018, so this was pre, the emergence of artistic AI, which is everywhere now. But we're starting to ask questions around how do people experience computer-generated art? When you kind of have the sense that there's no mind behind the art, does this impact on your experience of that art? So this was part of a bit bigger project, but I just wanted to focus on like one finding from the study, which is the more that people ascribed kind of human-like qualities to the robots, what we would call anthropomorphism, the more they liked the work that they produced. So there's something about the humanness of that robotic action that influenced their aesthetic judgment. And so I've been fortunate enough, let me just check this. Yeah, it should be. I've been fortunate enough to be working on a project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the German Research Council, which is an interdisciplinary project with computer scientists, artists, and psychologists. I've become really interested in how people experience artwork made by these machines, and is it impacted by this kind of human-like quality of the drawing? So this is our robot in our robotics lab at Goldsmiths, making a nice kind of portrait face, and yeah, I think you can already see this kind of, even the way that it dips the brush in the ink at the beginning, there's something really interesting there. In terms of kind of ascribing these kind of human-like conscious, intentional qualities. So that's what we were interested in asking. So we just completed a study where we looked at to what extent does viewing the robot as a tool or as an agent itself affect how people experience the artwork. So we made some little kind of vignettes around our robot. So we said something like the artist collaborates with Franca, the the robot or the artist uses Franca as a tool. And it's interesting because when you talk to the artists who work with these machines, they talk very differently. Some of them really humanize the robots and they really see it as a collaborative process, and others say, no, it's just a way of, it's like a glorified paintbrush. It just does things that are quite interesting. I can introduce randomness to it. So within the artistic community, there's very different kind of perspectives on this. And then we can also change the quality of the drawing movements. I'm going to call them kind of natural versus non-natural because I don't want to get too much into the technical details. But essentially, when we make actions, like when we make a drawing action, as people inhabiting human bodies, there is what's called a velocity profile to those movements. So if I do like a gesture like this, the gesture will speed up on the kind of straight lines, and when I curve my hand, it will necessarily slow down to minimize the jerkiness of the movements. And we have kind of models of that we can put into our robots to make them behave more human-like. And then we can also program them to look very machine-y. So we can just say, oh, there's no changes in velocity or acceleration, so they just go. So we can look at whether that has an impact. And we see that, indeed, both of these factors have an impact on how people evaluate the artwork. So the robot is seen as more intentional if I frame it as an agent and a collaborator with the artist versus a tool. And the effect of the drawing movements is that viewers like more natural movements, especially when the robot is framed as an agent itself. So all of this is, I think, when we impose sort of intentionality and human-likeness to robotic systems, that changes the way that we evaluate the work that they have produced. Okay, so one more kind of piece of evidence on this. So this really draws on this idea of kind of natural versus non-natural movements and how they affect our experience of artworks. So I guess one of the reasons that Picasso video is so lovely is, as I said, because he's drawing in this really effortless way, and that kind of comes across in the finished product. So the question here is, if a movement is sort of more natural and more beautiful, do we appreciate the outcome of that movement more? And so here again, we use kind of natural and non-natural movements. So on the one hand, we've got movements that look very much like a human movement would look like. So they speed up on the straight lines and get slower on the curves. So it looks like something like this. And what we can do is kind of use the thickness of the line to kind of emulate what it would look like if you had, imagine you had a brush with lots of ink and then it would go quite thin if you went very fast, and it would go quite thickly when you go quite slowly. And then what we can do is just reverse that process. So imagine if you were drawing a line that went really thick and slow on the straights and fast and thin on the bends. And what you get is a movement that looks quite jerky and non-natural. So what we do in this study is we show people these, we call them kind of graffiti tag drawing type things. They're certainly not artworks, but the beauty of these is that we have lots of control over them. And so we ask people, like, how much do you like this image? And then and just the static image. And then in a second phase, we show them the videos and we say, how natural is the movement that you're seeing? And what we see is a relationship between the two. So the more natural you see the movement, the more you like the outcome. And in this study, we also got artists and non-artists to make these judgments. And we found that artists were much more sensitive to this difference. So they really pick up on these movement dynamics in their evaluation of the final traces. So again, this kind of role of, like, there's something in the artistic training that really gives you that embodied knowledge of what's happening for the artist. And finally, I'm going to talk about another neuroimaging study. So where I talked about the structural differences between artists and non-artists, I was talking about structural magnetic resonance imaging, so we put them in a scanner. For this one, we're using EEG, which directly measures electrical activity via the scalp. And what's nice about EEG is it can give us, there is a kind of signature, an EEG signature of what's called motor simulation. And that is when, if you're watching someone perform a movement, the idea is that your brain is covertly simulating that movement without moving itself. And that might form a part of our kind of understanding of other people's actions. So if anyone's heard of the mirror neuron system that was found in monkeys, it's a sort of similar concept, that parts of the motor cortex of the brain are responsive to the actions of others. So we were interested in whether we could see this sort of neural signature when people are evaluating static artwork. So is the motor system contributing to this process of evaluating these artworks? So we have these funny little drawings again. Participants are set up with this EEG cap and this drawing tablet. They see a bunch of videos of these drawings, and they're either asked to reproduce the drawings or they just watch the video. And then we ask them, how much do you like this image, and do you remember seeing this image? And crucially, in that final phase, we have images that were drawn in the first phase, images that they just viewed the drawing happening, and then brand new ones that they'd never seen before. And so the question is, will viewers show more brain activity associated with motor simulation when they've already seen a drawing? So they have that kind of embodied knowledge. And what we see is that people prefer drawing movements that they either drew or saw in the first phase relative to new. But there doesn't really seem to be a difference in whether they actually had experience of making the drawing themselves. And we also see a difference in terms of experts here. So mu rhythm suppression is just a measure of this motor activity that's associated with seeing movements. And what we see is that, so we have an artist and a non-artist group, and what we see is that for the artists, they seem to be showing more mu rhythm suppression, which means more potential activity associated with motor processing in this phase where they're looking at these images of drawings if they've drawn them in the first phase. So it's a bit of a kind of complicated finding. So it seems that there's something about expertise and embodying this process that we're looking at more into now. But yeah, tentative evidence that there is something going on in motor cortex that might be underpinning some of these judgments. Okay, so to summarize the second part of the talk, do the actions of the artist impact how we see and appreciate them? More natural human-like movements lead to more preferred drawings, and there's some neural evidence that motor simulation is happening when we appreciate drawings, especially for experts, but it's something that we definitely need to follow up with some further research. Okay, so I wanted to finish on some kind of departing thoughts. So I want to emphasize what I said at the beginning, which is drawing is this fundamental human activity. Like, all kids do it. Our early human ancestors did it. It's a fundamental tool for learning, expressing, and communicating. So I think it really deserves attention from the psychological community, especially I think now in the age of all of this digital mediation. I've become really interested in the value of craft and doing things by hand, and I think that's a really important question to consider. If you can't convince people that drawing itself is interesting from an artistic perspective, you can say it's a window to many other psychological processes, so it's a really interesting way, especially now that we have really good technology for getting people to draw online and on tablets, and we can collect loads and loads of data, so we can start to understand things about vision and memory that were harder to get at before. And it's a really great tool for what we call phenomenology, like really understanding what it is like to experience something for someone, that some of these tasks where you're just pressing buttons can't really get at those qualities. Drawing is supported by and facilitates flexible attention, and it leaves a trace of human action that helps us connect with art. So much like these sort of early handprints in cave paintings. It's really it's the legacy of the artist's process. And with that, I'd just like to thank you for listening, and thank you to all my collaborators and funders, and to do another plug for the Masters in Goldsmiths. If you are a student or you know any students who are passionate about this area, then do direct them towards the program, because it's really fabulous and really interesting to see all the work that they're doing. So thank you very much.
Diolch yn fawr, thank you very much, Becky. So does anyone have a question that they'd like to ask Becky?
Can you hear me? Am I not
Yeah.
in the microphone?
Oh,
Yeah.
we're recording, so if you could just...
I'll try not to talk too loud into the mic. Is this on? There we go. Yeah. Thanks for that lecture. It was absolutely fascinating. I do a bit of drawing myself, so I'd kind of thought about a lot of these things. My previous life, I was an engineer, and I specialised in control systems design. So it's kind of a two-part question. The first part is, you've talked a lot here about drawings, as it were, as like representations of things, reproductions, if you like. So you're perceiving a thing and then you're reproducing it. So in my sort of simple, naive first-order considerations, that's a control system problem. So you can train your perception to get a better representation, and you can train your fine motor control to do a better reproduction of it. Maybe that's oversimplifying. So the first part of the question is, did you have any thoughts on that? The second part of it is, how is it different then? And I know drawing isn't necessarily the medium that's most often used for this, but when it's an abstract creation, so when it's not drawing as a reproduction, it's drawing of a thing that's its own value in and of itself, or of something abstract like a feeling or something like that. And how does that differ? And can you train that?
Yeah.
And did either of those questions make any sense?
Yeah.
It's been a long day.
They make absolute sense, and they're really and I think I'm definitely really stuck on this idea of kind of training perception. I think one thing that's, I guess, interesting with drawing, this idea of sort of zooming in on the local and not doing the sort of gist-based processing. In reality, that's not possible. Like, our visual systems are not set up to do that. And when you sort of look at the body of research on this, what we find is that the fundamental kind of building blocks of perception are not going to differ, and are not subject to any kind of training intervention, which is really handy, because it's very important that these fundamental mechanisms work for like everyday vision. And I think when I talk to my students about this, I really compare, like everyday vision works for seeing a bottle, being able to pick it up effectively, bringing it to my mouth and taking a drink. When we're an artist, we have to throw off a lot of those assumptions. So I think when I look at kind of drawing training strategies, a lot of the strategies that work are ways of kind of seeing the object in this kind of non-instrumental kind of action-based way. As far as the fine motor control research goes, we did a little bit of work looking at differences between artists and non-artists, didn't really find anything. So it's funny, because the brain imaging results seem to suggest that that's what's changing in the artist, but from a behavioral perspective, it doesn't seem to be playing a huge role. But it's probably that transfer of perception to motor action. And sort of motor planning, which, as far as I'm aware, I don't think there's much out there on that. So yeah, I think that the fine motor control itself probably isn't as important as interaction between perceptual and motor systems, and that's quite hard to get at from a psychological perspective. I've forgotten your second question.
The second bit was about sort of doing more abstract drawing. So what you've just said there, the conversion of perception into motor control. If you're doing an abstract drawing, because I'm particularly interested in conscious attention, what are you paying attention to convert into motor control?
I think, I've wanted to do work on abstraction for ages, and it's a really difficult problem to tackle. Also because, what do you mean by abstract? Because you can have, I could try and make a more symbolic representation of a bottle, or I could be trying to symbolize something that is not not seen?
Yeah, I'd sort of distinguish, sorry, I don't want to take up too much time because other people have probably got things to say, but I'd distinguish sort of impressionistic, like what Picasso did with the cow. He's illustrating a cow in sort of an impressionistic way, whereas an abstract drawing, like in its like most extreme abstractions, like I'm drawing an emotion, I'm drawing something intangible, and I'm making a representation of that. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, absolutely, yeah, and I think that yeah, that's the interesting nub. I feel like I think that these different artistic skills are probably kind of come with different kinds of systems. So because I focus on representational drawing, necessarily I think perceptual and attentional systems come online. There has been some work on visual mental imagery in artists. Interestingly, you would come into that research thinking, oh, well, artists must have really vivid visual imagery systems. Like that must be the kind of hallmark of visual art, but it's not the case, and there's some really interesting work in aphantasia, which is the inability to form mental images, and artists with aphantasia who produce incredible work without being able to formulate visual images. But my hunch would be that abstraction has something to do with imagery, so the ability to conjure images that are associated with concepts and then be able to read out those concepts. So probably still a bit of a kind of perception to action loop, but the perception is much more based on internally generated imagery. The debate as to whether imagery and perception rely on the same or different neural systems is still up for debate. So but I think it's a really interesting and hard question that I haven't. It was easy to focus on representational drawing because there's a thing and you're trying to, but I think it's a really, really interesting question.
Thank you.
That's great, thank you. That was really great, really enjoyed that. I teach brain anatomy here by teaching the psychology students and indeed the medics to draw brains. And I'm aware of that literature which suggests, I think there's about double the learning gain if you spend 5 minutes drawing something versus 5 minutes writing the equivalent words. So I'm interested in why you think that might be the case and the extent. I'm seeing your answer's probably going to be about agency and about actions, but I'd be intrigued to see why you think that we see that learning gain.
Yeah. So I think it's because drawings are multimodal. So especially, I guess this isn't quite the same with getting them to draw brain anatomy, but if I get you to draw a concept, so you could write out the word tree 20 times, or I could get you to draw a tree, and in that process you have to visualize a tree, you have to then execute a motor plan based on that tree and get feedback. So the information is just really enriched. I guess for drawing, I feel like, for brain anatomy, it's just like it takes time and you really pay attention. I think that the way that representational drawing engages with those kind of perceptual attentional systems really forces you to notice and discriminate between really subtle differences that I think is probably really important. So I think when it's drawing a concept, it's probably this kind of multimodal, rich representation. And when it's drawing representationally, it's the fact that it just takes a lot more time and you have to look really closely. But that's really interesting. I know also that there's been some interesting work, slightly tangential, but really interesting work with medical students and increasing their empathy for their patients by getting them to do kind of life drawing and realizing that all bodies and brains are different, and one of the best ways to do that is by drawing. I think that's really interesting.
Am I on?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Oh, so many questions actually, but I think probably. Maybe the most useful one is, from my point of view, is to just make an observation. My career background is psychology, but since retirement, I like to think I've become a practicing artist. Sounds a bit high-flown, I know. But anyway, and my thing is portraiture, and I get what you mean about the local versus global. But I think the other things going, I mean, clearly there's a lot of complex things going on. And what I've noticed is that when I start, then it's a kind of technical challenge. And you might start with the kind of overall picture and not worry too much about where you're putting the lines, because if you trust the process, you know that gradually you'll finesse it or whatever. And it is a technical challenge. And then after a while, it seems that something else starts to happen, or can happen, which is the empathy between you and the sitter. And there's a kind of, even though you may not be talking to each other, there's something going on, an interaction. And so part of what emerges is something about you as well as about the person that you're drawing. And I think that's really interesting. Yeah. But I do take your point about this global and local. I think that's really fascinating. And one of the things in studying artists that you find is that you do get, I think the term is outside in, but some artists do inside out. Now, Lucian Freud, for example, he starts at one point and works out from that point, and he can lose the global bit because he hasn't got enough room on the canvas to put the hand. So he's been known to tack on a bit of extra canvas, and then people assume that's an intentional thing to make it more kind of contemporary or whatever. It's just because he's run out of space because of this inside out. And you see how he starts the painting. He'll start with an eye, and he'll gradually work out from that eye. And amazing how he does it. So that's another thing that can happen, I think. Yeah. But the final thing I'd like to say is that drawing is a process of thinking. I think it's fascinating. And one of the beauties of drawing for me, and I must admit the robotic stuff I find a bit worrying. I haven't got my head around that yet. But one of the beautiful things about drawing is that the great drawers, if you take somebody like Degas, that you can see the process itself, whereas with painting, where you've got a more finished product, and people try to copy people's paintings, and they can't because they're not observing the process that's led to the end result. Whereas in drawing, you can see often see something of the process, those kind of construction lines that are quite faint. And the learning thing is that you know that those construction lines will kind of disappear. Well, they don't disappear, but they're not noticed as much. But when you do notice them, they're incredibly wonderful because you see something in the process. And it also creates a more dynamic kind of image. And I think it's a fascinating area. There's so much complexity going on. And kind of just one thing. With my background in psychology, I did a lot of consultancy stuff, leadership, stuff like that, you know. And one of the things is that, I mean, definitional issues around leadership, I know, but one of the things that we used to think that makes for a good leader is the ability to both immerse yourself in the system, but also to be able to step back and see the whole picture. And I just wonder whether this kind of artistic process of global, local, actually can translate into more social systems.
Yeah, all really interesting. I probably can't speak to all of that, but I guess I'll make a couple of points that, I absolutely, that connection with the sitter is really interesting. And I think what happens when you get better at whatever medium you're working with is it frees up your resources to be able to engage on that empathic level. So there was some really nice work with an artist, Humphrey Ocean, and they scanned his brain, I guess while he was drawing in the scanner, and they showed that actually he shows, relative to people who don't draw so much, he shows less activation in kind of, visual areas and motor areas, and more activation in regions of the frontal lobe, which suggests there's kind of higher order thinking. I mean, I always liken it to when you're learning how to drive a car. At first, like, you don't know, you're trying to work out clutch control, you're trying to look at your mirrors, you're trying to look down the road, and it all is just a jumbled mess. And then things start to automate, and then you don't even notice that you're changing gear, and you don't even notice that you're looking in the mirror, and then you can really look further down the road to see what hazards are approaching. And I think it's the same with any skill, and I think that's what, maybe you're talking about sort of feeling into that process of like, I can see what's happening, and now I can really try and connect with the person that is in front of me. I think on the Lucian Freud note, he was actually used to be in these slides because I've seen some of his work where he's got this kind of partially finished work, and you see this kind of purely local approach. I guess what I would say is that as a psychologist, I'm often I'm looking across groups of people. On average, how do artists behave? And underneath that all is a huge amount of variability. And for sure, some artists practice, they definitely use this kind of approach. And in fact, some of the kids with autism do this like very local approach, but they're so accurate that the finished product, like Freud, feels, Freud's not accurate, but it feels real. It feels real to our visual experience. So underneath the hood, there's a huge amount of variability. So these are sort of generalizable themes, but every artist practice is different.
Great, thank you. We are a little bit over time. Okay, that's fine. So thank you all for your very interesting questions, and please join me again to thank Rebecca for a very, very interesting talk. Thank you very much.